Good morning, everyone. Happy Father's Day to everyone. So, I just want to give a round of applause to all the fathers here today, if they were able to make it in person or online, or if they weren't able to make it for either one of them. Just give them a round of applause. Being a father is a hard job, but I don't know that personally because I'm just an uncle, so I get to let them run around and cause havoc. Today is the fifth week in our sermon series over the book of Judges. We looked at Othniel, Ehud, Deborah and Barak, Gideon, and now we are looking at our next judge, Samson, which is in Judges 13. Here's a question. When you were younger, did you ever play with Dominos? Not the pizza place, but playing with Dominos. I know the pizza place all too well from college. But there are a couple ways to play with dominoes, or more like a couple ways I know how to play with dominoes. The first way is whenever you get a domino, sit it up, facing up, and then you distribute the rest of the dominoes to all the other players evenly, and then you just expand from that with the number of dots matching up with the other number of dots. So if the domino in the middle has 6 and 6, then you will choose one of the dominoes where it has 6 dots on one side, and then you'll just match it up and you'll expand from there. The other way I know is the exact same way, except with 3-sided dominoes called triominoes. And I didn't know the name of those until I was doing research for the sermon and looking for dominoes myself. I went to Goodwill, Big Lots, but they didn't have any. But I did find triominoes in Goodwill. And the last way I know is whenever you stack them up, one after the other, and you knock them over from one end and watch it ricochet and trickle down. I would do that when I was in elementary school when we had recess indoors and I had nothing else to do. I was so bored that I would play with the dominoes there, and I would do that. But I would do that, and I would expand it, making it more and more complex, having loop-de-loops in it, putting dominoes on my desk so that way whenever I knock them over, it'll fall on the floor, and then knock the ones on the floor over. And I would keep doing that until it was time to clean up, and I didn't knock them over. So at the end, I would knock the one at the very top over and just watch it. That would take a couple minutes, and my teacher was mad at me. Say, Harrison, no, clean it up. On the topic of dominoes and not the pizza place, who knows what a domino effect is? Darren, 2 for 2. A domino effect is whenever an event sets off a series of similar or related events. So a domino effect of my life is I moved to Texas for high school. After high school, I moved back to Illinois for college. I heard that my school is downsizing, so I transfer to a different school. I meet this beautiful woman. We start to date. We get married, and she introduces me to Walnut Grove, and I start preaching here. That's a domino effect of my life. But what about a domino effect in your life? I had no idea what God was going to do with me. I had no idea what God was doing in that moment, especially at the beginning of that domino effect. Maybe you think that way too. Is that domino effect in your life the same as mine? Whenever you don't know exactly what God is doing, but then you get to the finish line and you're like, wow, what a trip. How everything would be so different if God just changed one thing about it. How the domino effect in your life shows great achievements because of your strength. And then it shows great weakness because of your strength. That's the power and the peril of strength. God does wonders when it comes to our life and our life story. We have no idea how God will use us. There will be that power and peril of strength. Nothing can be what we expect it to be. Being strong with it and being in danger with it. When it comes to having strength and being in danger of that strength, it's a perfect example to look at our judge Samson in Judges 13. And in Judges 13, we will look at the domino effect of Samson's story with the introduction of Samson with his birth and remarkable strength. Samson's victory that which leads to his downfall due to his weakness, and lessons on the misuse of God-given gifts and the consequences of uncontrolled desires. Now, like I said before, Samson's story starts in Judges 13, and this story isn't complete until Judges 16. So you will need to keep your finger on the Bible there, because this is a doozy. This is a long one. You thought last week was long. Last week was 3 chapters. This is 4. So before Judges 13, we know that Israel has been doing evil in the Lord's sight, and it repeats itself, and it's apparent here, Judges 13:1. Again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord handed them over to the Philistines, who oppressed them for 40 years. Come on, man. Come on. The cycle of sin, bondage, repentance, deliverance, blessing, and sin again continues to plague the history of Israel. We see this over and over again, sin repeating itself over and over again. The repetition of this cycle, it gets tiresome. It gets tiresome. Israel doing evil, then God handing them over for X amount of years for them to learn and for them to repent, only for them to do evil again. And they stayed with the Philistines for 40 years. That's a long time. 40 years ago today was 1984. I'm sorry to put that on you. The previous judges, when Israel did evil, they were oppressed for 7, 8, 18, 20, not in that order, and now 40 years. Continuing on, verse 2. In those days, a man named Manoah from the tribe of Dan lived in the town of Zorah. His wife was unable to become pregnant, and they had no children. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, even though you have been unable to have children, you will soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. So be careful. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden food. You will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut, for he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines. No, that's not Pepsi. That's just water. The tribe of Dan is located in Zorah, which is anywhere between 2.5 kilometers, or about 14 miles, and 24 kilometers, or about 18 miles. But then the angel of the Lord appears to this woman who cannot bear any children. And just like Gideon's passage, the angel of the Lord appears and gives a promise. For Gideon's passage, it was that he would rescue Israel. And for this, it was that this woman could have a baby, specifically a son. And much like Gideon's passage, this brings hope to the one hearing and witnessing the angel of the Lord. The angel tells the wife this promise and tells the rules about this baby. You must not drink wine or anything like that. That should be apparent in today's society because, well, it's not good. But they didn't know the effects of wine and alcohol on a baby in the womb. So this might have been a little strange to hear for just a regular person, but because they were a Nazirite, they were to have nothing to do with wine or grape production. And the baby was to be kept ceremonial clean, so the wife couldn't eat any unclean or forbidden food. She had to remain kosher, much like priests did back in the day. But what is most important about this passage is that even before Samson is conceived, not born, but conceived, the angel tells the wife that Samson will begin to save Israel. It is his destiny that he will do that. Now, if you look carefully, it says begin to save or begin to rescue. So he will not complete it, only start it. Kind of like making a line of dominoes. Verse 6. The woman ran and told her husband, a man of God appeared to me. He looked like one of God's angels, terrifying to see. I didn't ask where he came from, and he didn't tell me his name. But he told me, you will become pregnant and give birth to a son. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden food. For your son will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from the moment of his birth until the day of his death. One thing angels tend to do whenever they speak to someone, especially one of the first things that they do, is that they usually say, do not be afraid. And now we know why. And this translation that I read, which is the New Living Translation, it said, look like one of God's angels, terrifying to see. Other translations of that word terrifying translates to awesome or frightened or scary or terror laced with glory. And you see that she never asked for the angel's name or where the angel came from. But we can assume, much like the angel who appeared to Gideon, that this is an Old Testament appearance of Jesus Christ before his incarnation in Bethlehem. Because that title, Angel of the Lord, was used to describe the angel to Gideon. But it also shows that she was not worried about the information about where the angel came from, only about the information that the angel was giving her. Manoah, the husband, soon later got to meet this angel of the Lord and wanted to know the rules and know about raising this child and the angel and what the angel's name was. But the angel replied that his name was too wonderful to understand. So obviously it was a bunch of characters and letters that they didn't have back then, like pound key, asterisk, exclamation mark, front slash, backslash, all that kind of stuff. But much like Gideon, Manoah took a young goat and a grain offering, placed it on a rock like the proof that Gideon got. And it burned up, and the flames from the altar shot up toward the sky, and the angel disappeared. Verse 24. We're almost done with this first chapter. When her son was born, she named him Samson, and the Lord blessed him as he grew up. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he lived in Mahanadan, which is located between the towns of Zorah and Eshtaol. Now the birth of Samson has come, and the promise there that the angel of the Lord said has been fulfilled. Between verses 23 and 24, there is a time jump here, most likely a 9-month time jump, but because when speaking to the angel of the Lord the first time, it was before Samson's conception, and then the second time she spoke with the angel, it could have still been before conception or could have been after he was in the womb. The time there isn't necessarily specified here, but we can assume it was anywhere from 9 to 8 months, 1 month of a time jump there. And verse 23 ends that section, that second conversation. And these last two verses shows the birth of Samson and him growing up as well. And he was blessed as he grew up. So that is also a time jump there of how many years it was for him to grow up. But we also notice in 25, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir, which is not the last time that phrase will be said, the Spirit of the Lord. That phrase will be said in Samson's story multiple times. This is the first chapter of Samson's story, the introduction to his parents and to him. Now we'll look at the victories which will lead to his downfall due to his weakness. And we can see a domino effect start from here. Being born with the Spirit of God in him. Judges 14. Playing catch up a little bit because this is going to be a long sermon. 4 chapters is a long time. But a Philistine woman caught Samson's eye. Men, I know you all can relate to that. Guilty as charged for a woman catching your eye. And he rushed home to tell his parents, and his parents disapproved of it because the Philistines ruled over Israel. Picking up at verse 5. As Samson and his parents were going down to Timnah, a young lion suddenly attacked Samson near the vineyard of Timnah. At that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he ripped the lion's jaw apart with his bare hands. He did it as easily as if it were a young goat, but he didn't tell his father or mother about it. When Samson arrived in Timnah, he talked with the woman, and he was very pleased with her. Samson and his parents were walking near a vineyard, which is dangerously close to being compromised because, like I said, Nazarites were to have nothing to do with grape production. And because he was walking with his parents, it is also assumed that his parents just kind of gave up trying to talk Samson out of not seeing this woman because he had his mind set on her. He had his eyes set on her. But out of nowhere, a lion attacked Samson, which threatened both his life and his wedding plans. But Samson won in the end, killing the lion in a very graphic way, kind of like King Kong and the T-Rex from the 2005 King Kong movie. It was kind of like that fight. But he didn't tell his parents about it. He kept it a secret, which I think would have been hard, leaving your parents alone, killing a lion, then coming back to them out of breath, possibly with blood on you. That would have been hard to hide. But we also notice here that the Spirit of the Lord is said again, first at his birth and now here. with this fight. But then they arrived. Samson talked with the woman, and he was very pleased, signifying that this woman was right for him just by the conversation that he had. Now, after this event, Samson was returning to Timnah from the wedding and walked past the lion carcass, which is probably rotting by now, flies swarming around it, probably smelled rancid. But he also found a swarm of bees and some honey in it. So he took some of the honey, ate it, then took some of the honey and brought it back to his parents, who also ate it. But he didn't tell them where he got it from. And when he got to Timnah, there was a bachelor party for him where his soon-to-be parent-in-laws gathered 30 young men to be his colleagues to celebrate with him. Picking up at verse 12. Samson said to them, "Let me tell you a riddle. If you solve my riddle during these 7 days of celebration, I will give you 30 fine linen robes and 30 sets of festive clothing. But if you can't solve it, then you must give me 30 fine linen robes and 30 sets of festive clothing." "All right," they agreed. "Let's hear your riddle." So he said, "Out of the one who eats came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." 3 days later, they were still trying to figure it out. On the fourth day, they said to Samson's wife, "Entice your husband to explain the riddle for us, or we will burn your father's house down with you in it. Did you invite us to this party just to make us poor?" Now, before I continue, the answer to that riddle is not time or a river or a clock. What Samson wagered here was 30 fine linen garments and 30 changes of clothes, which would have been a new set of clothes per colleague, which would have cost a fine penny for them. And the riddle itself is not from Batman or from the Riddler, but it's from the encounter Samson had earlier. So, of course, his 30 colleagues didn't know what it was because they weren't there to experience him getting the honey from that lion. And this riddle also showed that even if Samson was weak morally, he was not weak intellectually, because that's a pretty clever riddle. And after 4 days of thinking of the riddle, with the men pondering about it, probably getting together and discussing what could the riddle be, they finally came to Samson's wife, which shows that they got married, but they also threatened his wife. "If you do not tell us the answer to this riddle, then we will burn your house down with you in it." That is scary. You might want to remember that. So Samson's wife told the men the answer, and the men told Samson the answer. Verse 18. So before sunset on the seventh day, the men of the town came to Samson with their answer. "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Samson replied, "If you haven't plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have solved my riddle." Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. He went down to the town of Ashkelon, killed 30 men, took their belongings, and gave their clothing to the men who had solved this riddle. But Samson was furious about what happened, and he went back home to live with his father and mother. So his wife was given in marriage to the man who had been Samson's best man at the wedding. Now the bet would have ended after sundown. So having men come up to Samson with the answer as the clock hit 0 must have been frustrating for him. "Oh man, 3 seconds left. Why couldn't you have just been 3 seconds late?" That shows how angry he is, but it also shows his anger by saying another riddle. "If you haven't plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have solved my riddle." In this other riddle that he says, he calls his wife a heifer, which is a young cow. And plowing here is a double entendre. Plowing as an agricultural sense with a yoke, and plowing in a sexual metaphor. We also see a title change for the 30 men. First, it was 30 companions, verse 11. Then it was his wife's people, verse 16 and 17. And finally, the men of the town, verse 18. And at the beginning of verse 19, for the third time, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson, a type of rage with great strength. And he went down to the town of Ashkelon and killed 30 men, looted their bodies, and gave what he found to the men. And this shows God's involvement in Samson's life. The bet was paid off, but with the blood of Philistines, and his wife went to his best man. We got to see this rising action here. Halfway through Samson's victories, and there are still more victories to come. And we can see the domino effect of Samson's life a little better now. Being born with the Spirit of God in him, finding a Philistine woman to marry, killing a lion which later had honey in it, giving a riddle to 30 companions, killing 30 Philistine men, and walking away from his wife. 2 chapters down, 2 more to go, exactly halfway done. And we saw that Samson left his wife, but to Samson, he was still married. And when he tried to come back to her, her father gave her away to the best man and tried to give her younger sister to Samson. This is the next chapter, chapter 15, verse 3. Samson said, "This time I cannot be blamed for everything I'm going to do to you Philistines." Then he went over and caught 300 foxes. He tied their tails together in pairs, and he fastened a torch to each pair of tails. Then he lit the torches and let the foxes run through the grain fields of the Philistines. He burned all their grain to the ground, including the sheaves and the uncut grains. He also destroyed their vineyards and olive groves. We can see here this act of revenge on the Philistines. And the second time, we see Samson do something bad to the Philistines. First was the 30 men, and now this. And it's ironic because whenever you think about it, think about this domino effect in Samson's story. If Samson never found this woman who was beautiful, then he wouldn't have done all these things. And this imaginary line of dominoes wouldn't exist. But then we see him wrestle with animals for a second time. The first time was with the lion, and now this time was with 300 clever foxes, which probably would have taken most of the area we have outside service. 300 foxes, that's a lot. Actually, probably more than that area. And he tied 2 foxes together, putting a torch to each pair of tails and lighting the torches on fire, letting the foxes run wild. And when you look at the other instances where Samson does a violent act, the Spirit of the Lord is said. In this, it isn't said, so it's Samson's will that he's doing it. And the foxes destroy precious food that the Philistines were saving, and the food that are still growing, food that they have to put into storage, all their food gone. Continuing on, verse 6. "Who did this?" the Philistines demanded. "Samson," was the reply, "because his father-in-law from Timnah gave Samson's wife to be married to his best man. So the Philistines went and got the woman and her father and burnt them to death. Because you did this," Samson vowed, "I won't rest until I take my revenge on you." God used all of this to advance his plan for Israel and redemption. We can't forget that. But because of Samson's disobedience, it all happened at a great personal cost to Samson, with his wife dying, his wife being burnt to death. And we see that in chapter 14, verse 15, the 30 men threatened the wife with burning her house down with her in it, but yet she was still burnt, even after she gave them the answer to the riddle. And what we see here is a bitter story of retaliation, of trying to avenge wrongs done to us. Retaliation is a never-ending story, and no one ever wins. After that incident, Samson killed many of the Philistines. The exact number is not said, and after that, 3,000 men of Judah came and found Samson at the cave of the rock of Etam, where they were going to tie him up and give him over to the Philistines. Verse 14. As Samson arrived at Lehi, the Philistines came shouting in triumph, but the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson, and he snapped the ropes on his arms as if they were burnt strands of flax, and they fell from his wrists. Then he found the jawbone of a recently killed donkey. He picked it up and killed 1,000 Philistines with it. Then Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey I've piled them up. With the jawbone of a donkey I've killed 1,000 men." When he finished his boasting, he threw away the jawbone, and the place was named Jawbone Hill. Samson is a unique instance whenever it comes to all the judges and judges, because he was a one-man army, whereas the other judges led armies. Samson only had 2 guns. And it's cool to point out here how similar these verses are to the lion. Both the lion and the Philistines came announcing their presence with either a roar or shouting. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson, so we know that this is God's doing, and he either tore or struck down the enemy. And after he was done, he cried out to God, saying, He must die of thirst because, well, killing 1,000 men single-handedly is exhausting. Not that I've done that before, but it's exhausting. God allowed water to gush out of a hollow in the ground where he was revived, and he called that place the spring of the one who cried out. And he judged Israel for 20 years during that period, which is half the time Israel was under Philistines' jurisdiction. And we have looked at the domino effect of Samson's story with the introduction of Samson with his birth and his remarkable strength. We've looked at Samson's victories, which will soon lead to his downfall due to his weakness, and we will look at the lessons on the misuse of God-given gifts and the consequences of uncontrolled desires. From this new part of Samson's story, let's add to the domino effect. Taking vengeance by burning the Philistines' food, which led to the men of Judah capturing Samson, Samson killing 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone of a donkey, and judging Israel for 20 years. We have come to the final part of Samson's story, the last chapter of his story. I know, it's pretty long. We're almost there, I know. Samson went to Gaza for one reason or another. But we see here that men of Gaza knew that Samson was there, and they were going to kill him at dawn. But Samson woke up at midnight and just said to himself, you know what, I'm going to do something funny. I'm going to take the town doors of Gaza, which was about 4 tons or the weight of a female African elephant, and I can't stop and think that this is hilarious. Just getting up in the middle of the night and just taking the doors. That is hilarious. Picking up Judges 16, verse 4. Sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman named Delilah who lived in the valley of Sorek. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, entice Samson to tell you what makes him so strong and how he can be overpowered and tied up securely. Then each of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me what makes you so strong and what it would take to tie you up securely. Samson replied, if I were tied with 7 new bowstrings that have not yet dried, I would become as weak as anyone else. So the Philistine rulers brought Delilah 7 new bowstrings, and she tied Samson up with them. She had hidden some men in one of the inner rooms of her house, and she cried out, Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you. But Samson snapped the bowstrings as a piece of string snaps when it is burnt by a fire. So the secret of his strength was never discovered. No, Delilah is not the one from the Plain White T's songs, Hey There, Delilah. She didn't live in New York City. But Samson fell for a woman who, yet again, was not good for him. And he was blinded by love here because he didn't guard his heart. But the Philistine rulers, they knew that he was in cahoots with this woman, Delilah. And they came to her and they asked her to tell Samson his secret for his strength and his weakness. Now, the Philistine rulers, it could be any number, but it is most likely 5 Philistine rulers, 1 ruler per Philistine city, and they bribed Delilah. And this isn't the first time that Philistine men came and tried to entice this woman that Samson was seeing. The first time was with his wife, where the men threatened her, and this time it was enticing her with money. So if it was 1,100 pieces of silver per person that came to her, if there was 5 people that came to her, that is 5,500 pieces of silver, 100 pounds per person, that is 700 pounds of silver, which she wouldn't be able to lift. That is heavy. And Samson hears Delilah about her request, and he tells her a lie. Tie me with bowstrings that are so wet, and I'll be as weak as anyone else. But that's not the first time he did that. He told her lies about his kryptonite 3 times. Bowstrings, a new rope, and weaving his hair in a fabric loom. And 3 times, Delilah says to Samson, Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you, but yet she was wrong each time. Samson kept lying. I don't know why he didn't leave. Well, that's easy, because he was blinded by love. But she kept asking for his weakness. over and over again until Samson was sick and tired of her nagging. Stay with me now. This is the last chapter, verse 17. Finally, Samson shared his secret with her. My hair has never been cut, he confessed, for I was dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as anyone else. Delilah realized he had finally told her the truth, so she sent for the Philistine rulers. Come back one more time, she said, for he has finally told me his secret. So the Philistine rulers returned with the money in their hands. Delilah lulled Samson to sleep with his head in her lap, and then she called in a man to shave off the 7 locks of his hair. In this way she began to bring him down, and his strength left him. Then he cried out, Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you. When he woke up, he thought, I will do as before and shake myself free. But he realized the Lord had left him. So the Philistines captured him and gouged out his eyes. They took him to Gaza, where he was bound with bronze chains and forced to grind grain in the prison. But before long, his hair started to grow back. He finally told Delilah the truth because he was just tired of her nagging. Cut my hair and my strength will leave me. And the Philistines left Delilah because they were sure that Delilah wouldn't succeed in this. But she was able to bring the Philistine rulers back because the power of greed is very powerful to the greedy. And she shaved his head when he was vulnerable, whenever his head was on her lap, possibly whenever she was combing his hair with her fingers, and he fell asleep. And then she brought someone in to shave his head, his 7 locks. And then whenever he woke up, he thought he could escape again, but he was wrong. And I don't know about you, but if I had 7 locks of hair on my head, possibly dreadlocks, because if you don't brush your hair and you let it grow out, then it will naturally mat and you will have dreadlocks. But if I had those and they were shaved off, then I would have noticed. My head would have been cold. My head would have been lighter. But he didn't notice. He thought to himself that he can just escape as he did before, but he was wrong. Once he was captured, he became physically blind. His eyes were gouged out. He was blinded by love because he didn't leave this woman, because he didn't guard his heart, and now he was physically blind by his eyes. And he was thrown into jail in the city where he stole the town gate from, Gaza, which is really ironic. And his hair started to grow back, so he has been there. He has been in jail for a while. And after he was in jail, there was a party where the half-drunk party guests wanted Samson to entertain them. So a young servant got him. Verse 26. Stay with me now. We're almost done. A few more verses. Samson said to the young servant who was leading them by the hand, place my hands against the pillars that hold up the temple. I want to rest against them. Now the temple was completely filled with people. All the Philistine rulers were there, and there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof who were watching as Samson amused them. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, Sovereign Lord, remember me again. O Lord, please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes. Then Samson put his hands on the 2 center pillars that held up the temple. Pushing against them with both hands, he prayed, let me die with the Philistines. And the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people. So he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. Later, his brothers and other relatives went down to get his body. They took him back home and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol, where his father Manoah was buried. Samson had judged Israel for 20 years. There wasn't a huge army guarding Samson with all these stories about Samson. You'd think that the Philistines would have said, hey, you know what? I think we should get like 100 men. No, 100,000 men to guard Samson. But you know what? Let's just have a young boy guard him. That was a mockery of him. That was a humiliation of Samson. And this party had about 3,000 people, which is a pretty big party. And this is the second time Samson cries out to the Lord, which is right before his death. The first time was whenever he thought he would die of thirst, and this is the second time, leaning there against the pillars that held up the roof. And because this is a pretty big party, the temple that they were in was probably really big. So if it was like the ancient Greek Parthenon, with the pillars being close together, so that way it could hold up the heavy stones and distribute the weight evenly. If you were able to take one pillar out, then everything would crumble, kind of like dominoes. And this is the bittersweet moment to this end, the loss of a one-man army, but allowing the death of the Philistine rulers and 3,000 Philistine people in total. And after all that has been said and done, after the temple fell, after news of the temple falling, possibly through the news that the enemy Samson is dead, his family came and buried him with his deceased family. We have looked at the domino effect of Samson's story, about his life, with the introduction of Samson with his birth and his remarkable strength, Samson's victories which led to his downfall due to his weakness, and the lessons on the misuse of God-given gifts and the consequences of uncontrolled desires. From the new part of Samson's story, from this last chapter, let's add on to that domino effect. Falling in love with another woman who was not good for him, telling her his weakness, losing his strength, losing his sight, and being thrown into jail, and finally calling out to God to give him one last bit of strength, allowing to kill 3,000 Philistines. This was a long sermon. I understand that. Over 4 chapters, but we have finally come to the end. We looked at the domino effect of Samson's life and how his story played out. And as a refresher, a domino effect is when one event sets off a series of similar or related events. And when we look at the domino effect of Samson's life, we can see these events playing out. Being born with the Spirit of God, I really hope these don't fall over. Finding a Philistine woman to marry, killing a lion which later had honey in it. Oh, please don't fall over. Giving a riddle to 30 companions, killing 30 Philistine men, walking away from his wife, taking vengeance by burning the Philistines' food, which led to the men of Judah capturing Samson, Samson killing 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, judging Israel for 20 years, falling in love with a woman who was not good for him, telling her his weakness, losing his strength, losing his sight, and being thrown into jail, and finally calling out to God to give him one last bit of strength, allowing to kill 3,000 Philistines. When we look at the domino effect of our lives, we can see how different it would be if God took one single domino out. If God took one single domino out from the middle and he knocked it over, then the rest wouldn't fall as well. If God changed one thing, then the whole story would be different, would be very different. In this illustration, I'm the one setting up the dominoes and knocking them over. But in Samson's life, in Samson's story, God is the one building the dominoes and knocking them over, allowing for the Spirit of the Lord to enter Samson, allowing God's plan for Israel to be free as the last domino falls. Our lives might not be as violent as Samson's life, but it is definitely a life where God uses us, where he blesses us, where he encourages us, where he uses us to better the kingdom of God. This right here is the power and the peril of strength. If you all would bow your heads with me.